For a long time now, it's been usual to see Western philosophy in the 17th and 18th centuries as divided between two opposing schools, British empiricism and continental rationalism, the chief of the empiricists being Locke, Berkeley and Hume, and the chief of the rationalists being Descartes, Spinoza and Leibniz. Of the many issues that divided them, the most important, put at its crudest, was this. The rationalists believed that we human beings can acquire important knowledge of reality by the use of our minds alone, by thinking, by pure reason. The empiricists denied this. They insisted that experience was always a necessary ingredient, and that all our knowledge of what actually exists must, in the end, in some way or other, be derived from experience. Again, the traditional view has been that these two opposing schools finally came together at the end of the 18th century and were combined in the work of Immanuel Kant. In this program, we're going to take a look at Spinoza and Leibniz, the two greatest of the rationalist philosophers after Descartes. The first in time was Spinoza, born in Amsterdam in 1632. His family were Portuguese Jews who, in the aftermath of the Spanish Inquisition, emigrated to Holland in search of religious freedom. Spinoza was brought up and educated in an enclosed Jewish community. But he rebelled against religious orthodoxy, and at the age of only 24, he was excommunicated by the Jewish authorities. Fortunately for him, he was a loner by temperament as well as circumstances, and he chose a solitary mode of life in order to do his work. When he was offered a professorship at Heidelberg University, he turned it down. He earned his living grinding lenses for spectacles, microscopes, and telescopes, and it's believed that the daily inhaling of glass dust from this occupation aggravated the lung ailment that killed him at the early age of 44. His acknowledged masterpiece, a book entitled Ethics, but in fact dealing with the whole range of philosophy, came out after his death, but in the same year, 1677. A striking feature of this book is that it's modelled directly on Euclid's geometry. Starting from a small number of axioms and primitive terms, it proceeds by deductive logic to prove a long succession of numbered propositions which, taken together, lay out the total scheme of reality. It's often held up as the supreme example of a self-contained metaphysical system whose object is to explain everything. In only the year before his death, Spinoza had a series of meetings with the other philosopher we're going to consider, Leibniz, one of comparatively few instances of two of the greatest philosophers actually meeting each other and having face-to-face discussions. As a personality, Leibniz was a complete contrast to Spinoza, courtier and diplomat, always travelling, honoured in many countries. He was one of the great polymaths of our culture. It was he who coined the notion of kinetic energy. He invented calculus, not knowing that Newton had already done so, and published it before Newton did. In fact, it's his notation, not Newton's, that we use to this day. And he was among the great philosophers. Leibniz was born in Leipzig in 1646 and died in Hanover at the age of 70 in the year 1716. So brilliant was he as a student that he was offered a professorship at the age of 21. But, like Spinoza, he turned it down, though for the opposite reason. He wanted to be a man of the world. He spent most of his life at the court of Hanover, in the service of successive dukes, one of whom became King George I of England, founder of the present British royal family. Leibniz carried out almost every task imaginable for a person in such a position, and his philosophy was, as one might put it, written in his spare time. He wrote an enormous amount, mostly in the form of quite short papers, but published scarcely any of it during his life. He also maintained a voluminous international correspondence, which is now of philosophical importance. Among his outstanding works are The Monadology, The Discourse on Metaphysics, and a book called New Essays Concerning Human Understanding, which is a point-by-point argument with his English near-contemporary John Locke. To discuss the work of Leibniz and Spinoza, I've invited someone who is well known both as a philosopher and as a historian of philosophy, Anthony Quinton, chairman of the British Library, formerly president of Trinity College, Oxford. Anthony Quinton, for clarity's sake, I think we're going to have to deal with our two philosophers separately, but before we start doing that, is there anything that can be said usefully about them jointly?
Well, I think there is. The one you've mentioned already, it's a standard piece of tidy, convenient classification. They're the three rationalists who face the three British empiricists, these two opposed triads of thinkers. Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, they do have a community of style and purpose. Descartes defined the terms, laid down the agenda, but in a sense the world that Descartes produced by the exercise of pure reason, or the conception of the world that Descartes produced, is a fairly straightforward affair. He does preserve the self in a recognizable form, the human individual. He, in the natural, straightforward terms of his age, produces God, even if it's not a terribly human sort of God. And he preserves the material world in a, broadly speaking, recognizable form, even if deprived of some of its more vivid and colorful and odoriferous attributes. But the worlds created by the application of the procedure of rationalism, the one you mentioned, you start from some self-evident propositions, like a person producing a system of geometry, and then you carry out processes of absolute, straightforward deduction from these self-evident propositions. What that led to, in the case of Spinoza and Leibniz, is something very far removed in both of them from the ordinary understanding of the world. To some extent, Descartes, by comparison with them, is in the business of saving the appearances. Spinoza and Leibniz both say what the world is really like is very different from what it appears to the ordinary person to be.
That in both cases there is an underlying reality which philosophy can tell us about, even if common observation doesn't.
That's right. And a very odd world it is in each case. I mean, just to state in very brief terms what it is, there in each of them, it's so utterly opposed in the two cases, yet they purport to be following the same procedure and under what one might call broadly Cartesian guidance. Spinoza's world is a unitary world. There is only one true thing, which is the world as a whole, which is both extended and in some sense mental, a system of ideas. On the other hand, in Leibniz's case, the real world consists of an infinity of things that are purely spiritual, and everything material and space itself are phenomena, appearances, byproducts, as it were, of the real world, which is this infinite array of spiritual centers.
Right, well now let's start taking them one by one, and let's begin with Spinoza. It is this enormously elaborated single system, and it's often difficult to know where to break into a system when one wants to start expanding it. Where do you think is the best place to start?
Well, there are a number of places you could begin. I think one had better say just a bit more about Spinoza's method, because he himself says that this book, Ethics, is demonstrated in the geometrical manner. And as you mentioned in your remarks at the beginning, he does set it out with all the familiar apparatus of geometry, things called axioms and postulates and definitions, and the end of each bit of argument has the letters QED, as if it were a straight piece of geometrical reasoning. Funny thing is that on the whole, subsequent philosophers haven't taken Spinoza's reasonings frightfully seriously. People don't think of him as a reservoir of interesting arguments, whereas they do think that of Leibniz. Anyway, so perhaps the method, although it's the most obvious feature, this very explicit and conscious geometrical method is the real stylistically obvious feature of Spinoza's work, it's not what's really important, which is, I suppose one must say, a vision. And this vision is of the world as an absolutely unitary entity, any division of which is a mutilation of some sort of misunderstanding.
He saw total reality as being one thing, didn't he? One substance, of which all apparently different objects, and indeed people like ourselves, are merely facets, merely modes, merely aspects. This is a very difficult idea, I think, for most people to grasp at a first meeting. Can you unpack it a bit for us?
Well, probably the best place to begin is, again, I promise I won't go on doing this, with Descartes, because Descartes defined substance, and the idea of substance in philosophy is a name for what it is that really exists, what the real components of the world are. Descartes defined substance as that which requires nothing but itself in order to exist. And in terms of his view of things, the only true substance, therefore, was God, because everything that existed apart from God, and he thought that consisted of human souls and material objects, including the human body. Everything apart from God was dependent on God for its existence. So its substantiality, its title to being substance, was a little defective. God was the only absolute substance, but from that point onward, he didn't draw any further attention to it. Now, you could see Spinoza as taking that point of Descartes really seriously and saying, no, there truly is only one substance, only one thing which, to use a free translation of his own essential phrase for it, is the explanation of itself. Only one thing whose essence explains its existence, whose nature it is to exist. And his conclusion was that the only thing of which that is true is the totality of what there is, absolutely everything. And the one vaguely commonsensical element in Spinoza is to say absolutely everything, the totality, the one substance, is in fact nature as well as God.
Another argument that he used for that derived from from God's infinite nature, didn't it? That if God was infinite, there isn't anything that isn't God. Or to put the same argument the other way around, if the world is separate from God, then God has boundaries, God has limits. God is finite and not infinite. For God to be infinite, he must be coextensive with everything.
That, I think, is probably as plausible a way as you could find of arguing for Spinoza's position, and it has anticipations in earlier philosophy. He goes through a good many other arguments to establish his general point. But what it really amounts to is there's only one thing whose explanation lies within itself. For everything else, its explanation lies somewhere outside it. And the odd thing is that this one thing, all right, so to one extent, from one point of view, it's nature, the totality of what there is in space. But on the other hand, it's God. It's something, broadly speaking, mental. Now, and he says God or nature is the true name of the one substance.
Now, there's a big step, isn't there, at least for us, and I'm sure there must have been for him and his contemporaries too, between seeing the whole of reality as being a unity, which is one idea, and then seeing that unity as being divine or as being God. That seems a quite different step to take in the argument. What were his grounds for doing that?
Well, I suppose it was essentially God's perfection, that nature wasn't treated as some passive byproduct of God's activity, but nature was the totality of what there was, the self-explanatory thing, and so to that extent was a perfect entity, the most perfect thing there could be, and therefore deserved the name God. The only God, if you like, he was prepared to countenance was a God that was identified with the whole array of natural things.
So summing up Spinoza's vision, which was the very good word you used for it just now, he was saying in effect that if we call the totality of everything there is nature, then we can say in our terminology that there is no supernatural or supranatural realm, and also that God cannot be outside nature. God must be coextensive with the totality of what there is if God is infinite.
That seems perfectly reasonable.
Now, this would seem to solve one of indeed the most notoriously unsolved problem left by Descartes, which was the problem of how mind and matter interact with each other. Descartes' work posed that problem, but didn't really provide an acceptable solution to it. Spinoza is now in a position to say, well, the problem doesn't really arise, because, in fact, everything is a different aspect of the one thing which is everything.
Certainly the two things you mentioned, which constituted a special problem for Descartes, which he had a bold and highly unsatisfactory solution for, mind and body, these are brought together in an ingenious fashion by Spinoza, and it could be seen, as it often has been seen by historians of philosophy, that we should best understand Spinoza as coping with that problem of Descartes. But I think that's rather a limited conception of what Spinoza's up to. He's after a bigger game than that, a proper total conception of things. What he says is, in developing this thought that the one substance is infinite, he says not only does it contain everything and have nothing lying outside it, which is an idea close to, if not identical with, the idea of infinity, but that God or nature, the single substance, the one substance, the totality of what there is, has an infinity of attributes. Now, this sounds a little puzzling, and it is puzzling, because as it turns out, only two of these attributes are in any way accessible or intelligible to us. The others have to be taken on faith that it has the rest of them. But the two we know are the attributes of thought or consciousness on the one hand, the attribute of extension on the other. And what Spinoza maintains is that every wrinkle in the total fabric of the one substance, these wrinkles he calls modes, and that is the proper understanding of what we think of as self-subsistent things, tables, chairs, our wife's family, whatever it might be, various identifiable items that have clear, definite contours. For Spinoza, they're just temporary contours taken on by the fabric of everything that there is.
Like waves in the sea.
Each of these is at once conscious and extended. And so there are the phases or aspects or wrinkles, as I call them, of reality are at one and the same time have these two aspects, a mental aspect and a physical aspect. Therefore, there isn't a question of two utterly separated things happening to keep where, in some cases, in time with one another, to chime in with one another. They are one and the same thing viewed from two directions.
Now, we've both made much of the fact that Spinoza presents his philosophy as if it were Euclidean geometry or on the lines of Euclidean geometry. Now, with a system that is set out deductively, in which everything follows from everything else, there simply isn't any room for free will, is there? What was Spinoza's attitude to the whole free will question or the whole free will problem?
Well, I think that can be put very clearly in a couple of sentences to start with. What he does maintain is that what he would probably call the everyday, vulgar, commonsensical notion of freedom, that is to say, the idea that the human individual can sometimes act as a spontaneous, uncaused cause of things, the freedom of pure spontaneity, this, he says, is impossible. It's simply an illusion that's engendered by our not knowing what the causes of our actions are. But on the other hand, this is the other sentence, Spinoza says there is such a thing as human servitude or bondage, and that consists in being induced to act by some causes rather than others. There are some causes, we can call them, generally speaking, the passive emotions, things like hatred and anger and so forth, generated in us by the frustrating influence of the world outside us, the parts of the world, I'd better say, that are outside us. And he also believes that we have active emotions, which are those generated by an understanding of our circumstances in the world, a knowledge of what's going on. And the greater our activities are caused by active emotions and the less by passive emotions, the less in bondage we are, because we are more ourselves.
I think he was probably the first person in European thought to introduce this very important idea, which in a quite different form is made much of a great deal later by Freud and by psychoanalysis, that discovering what the hidden sources of your actions and emotions are will be, in a sense, liberating, will make you happier, even if it doesn't literally increase your freedom.
I think you're right. I mean, you could see Spinoza's attitude to man's position in the world as a stoic one, the idea that the world around us is not particularly interested in us, therefore we must diminish its power to make us suffer by controlling the emotions it excites in us. That's a Stoic idea, but you're quite right in saying there's something more in Spinoza, because it's not the idea of, by a terrific effort, repressing or overcoming these sad, unfortunate, passive emotions. It's by the exercise of the mind, gaining an understanding of the world which just makes these emotions peter out or fade away, and their place come to be occupied by the active emotions, the most elevated of which, as he describes it, is what he calls the intellectual love of God, which is a rather mysterious business. It's the emotion that attends a metaphysical understanding, a total comprehensive understanding of the world.
Don't you think there's something paradoxical about the fact that he's commonly thought of as a religious or quasi-religious thinker, in view of the fact that he doesn't believe in free will, he doesn't believe in the immortality of the soul, because he doesn't believe that anything is permanently separate from anything else. He doesn't even believe in the existence of a personal God, because he thinks that the divinity is identical with nature. Is it right, you think, to think of him as a pantheist?
Well, I think it's right to think of him as a pantheist, but that, to go back to what you said before, to say that isn't to deny that he's religious. The thing is, there's a very considerable correspondence between many of his views and many of the views of the roughly contemporary British philosopher Thomas Hobbes. But Thomas Hobbes was a man of, in some ways, indestructible cheeriness, but who thought the universe was a pretty gloomy setup, and was, in fact, despite some references to God, I think fairly clearly describable in a literal way as an atheist. Spinoza, on the other hand, his attitudes are religious. It's one of awe and respect for the universe at large. And the thing is, in our Christian civilization, we lay down certain requirements on the religious attitude which are not universally applicable. In other words, it's parochial of us to deny that Spinoza is a genuinely religious person, because the attitudes which in our cultural background are normally adopted towards a personal, wrathful, interested God are, in his case, adopted towards the whole scheme of things. He's religious, if you like, in the way perhaps Wordsworth is religious.
One rather dramatic way he had of putting his identification of God with nature, which appeals to me very much, is this. He once said that it's quite right and proper that an individual should love God, but it's absurd that he should want God to love him. It's as if a man were to love nature and expect nature to love him back.
That's quite right. There's plenty of parallel for this kind of view of man's place in the universe in the more elevated and sophisticated types of Buddhism. But I think on reflection one has to admit that these are, in their total place in the economy of human life, these attitudes are genuinely religious attitudes, even if they're directed towards objects which are not the familiar objects of religious attitudes in our culture.
Do you think that Spinoza was in any important degree influenced in all this by his Jewish background?
Well, I would have thought so, because just to make two very simple points, or perhaps three, to take up your big Kantian trinity of God, freedom, and immortality. The Jewish God is personal, all right, but on the whole, immortality is not very emphatically central to Jewish religion. And freedom, well, perhaps there's freedom, but in the general domain of the ethical, or the ethical relationship to God, the Jewish religion doesn't have a place for petitionary prayer, for asking God to do things for you. The Jewish view is one of grateful acceptance of what God offers. One's not always seeking favors from God, as the Christian is. One accepts what God has to give one with such tolerance and submission as one can bring to bear. And that is a very Spinozist point of view.
Well, as you said earlier, I think the thing for us to do with Spinoza isn't to attempt to recapitulate the arguments, but to convey the vision. And I think you've done that very well. And I think we should now move to a discussion of our second philosopher, Leibniz, who also had a great big interlocking metaphysical system, except that in his case, he never put it forward in one single work, but it came out in bits here and there in different papers, letters, arguments, discussions, and so on, so that one has to, as it were, put it together for oneself. Where do you think the best place to start with Leibniz is in trying to expand his system?
Well, it's probably the case that were one writing a very, very serious professional treatise on Leibniz, one would start with certain logical doctrines he has. But I think for the comprehension of what he's up to in fairly short order, the place one has to start is the idea of the monad, his notion of substance. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, this is utterly opposed to Spinoza's, because the monad is something tiny. I mean, it's unextended, in fact. There'll be monads of all sorts. God is a monad.
Yes, I think you must give some kind of general definition of what a monad is.
Well, a monad is Leibniz's word for substance, a single unit. It has a number of properties. There's an argument at the beginning of Leibniz's monadology, which is, in fact, not a very sophisticated argument for as clever a man as Leibniz. He says whatever is complex is made up of what's simple, and the simple components of what's complex are the real constituents of the world, and the complex are just a byproduct of the aggregation of these simples. But whatever occupies space, is extended, is complex. Therefore, the ultimate components of the world, as non-extended, are non-material, because not extended in space. Therefore, the real world is composed of an infinity of unextended metaphysical points. And each of these, because non-material, and here he just relies crudely on Descartes, if you like, is therefore spiritual. Ergo, the world consists of an infinity of point-like spiritual items, mental items, or, as people sometimes say, he himself at times, souls, all the way from the most important of them, the crucial one, God, down through the human soul, which is the particular monad where we get the idea of substance from in the first place, down to the ultimate constituents of what we conceive, confusedly, as matter.
I think this is such a lot for people to take in at once that I'd like to go over the main points of it again. Leibniz is saying that everything that's complex must be analyzable into simpler elements. If the simpler elements are still complex, then they must be further analyzable. And therefore it must be the case that sooner or later you come to simple, not further analyzable constituents of matter or the world or the universe or whatever it might be. Now, these simple constituents can't be material because the very definition of matter is that it's something extended, and extension is always subdivisible. So if they're not further subdivisible, they can't be extended. And if they're not extended, they can't be matter.
Yes.
So the ultimate constituents of reality must, he thinks, be something immaterial and not occupying space. I suspect that it's only our way of putting it up to this point in the discussion that makes it sound as weird as it does, because after all, one of the most influential doctrines of 20th century physics is that energy is the ultimate constituent of the universe, and that all matter is ultimately constituted by energy. Now, it seems to me that Leibniz was trying, or was groping towards, in the vocabulary of his day, something very close to that he was trying to say that all matter is ultimately made up of centers of activity which are not matter. And I think in the 17th century, if you were trying to talk about centers of activity which are not matter, the only vocabulary available to people was the vocabulary of minds, souls, something of that kind. Do you think I'm falling over backwards to save him?
No, not at all.
I think that Leibniz is in many striking ways a very modern thinker. I mean, when you read him, it's a bit like reading the early Bertrand Russell or Frege or the young Wittgenstein or something. And one of the strikingly modern doctrines, which I think he was the first person to formulate clearly, and which certainly plays a very powerful role in philosophy to this day, is the idea that all meaningful statements must be of one of two kinds. That a statement can either be true in the way that a definition is true, that's to say that if you say something like all bachelors are unmarried, you don't have to carry out a survey of the bachelors in society to see if that's true or not. You know it must be true by virtue of the meaning of the terms. So all you have to examine outside the statement itself is the rules governing the use of the terms in the statement. But there's another kind of statement, like, for example, there's a monkey in the next room. To find out that may be true or may be false, it can be either, unlike the statement all bachelors are unmarried, and the only way you can find out whether it's true or false is to go and have a look. In other words, there are truths that must be true because of the nature of the terms involved. There are other truths which are or are not truths by virtue of the way things are in the world, and therefore that can only be established by experience. And Leibniz was, I think I'm right in saying, the first person thoroughly clearly to expound that dichotomy. Is that not so?
That's perfectly correct. You mentioned earlier that Locke was a near contemporary. There's a sort of adumbration of it in Locke, but it's a bit misty. In Leibniz's case, it's absolutely clear and lucid, the distinction between what he calls truths of reason on the one hand, which it would be a contradiction to deny, and truths of fact on the other hand, which it's not a contradiction, or not evidently, at any rate, a contradiction to deny. The trouble is that under the pressure of his metaphysical commitments, the distinction between the two, as it were, evaporates at the margin. Sometimes it's put by saying, well, there are finitely analytic statements or finite truths of reason which in a finite number of steps can be shown to be such that it would be a contradiction to deny them. But truths of fact turn out to be infinitely analytic in a certain sense.
You could never 100% know.
We can't know
We can't. Yes.
that they're necessarily true, or that it would be a contradiction to deny them.
But in spite of the qualifications that you draw, it would be difficult to think of any philosophical doctrine that had been more influential in the last 200 or 300 years.
No, because you're quite right, because it was in terms of that distinction, which he proceeded to muddle in a fruitful and interesting, but I would suggest ultimately mistaken way, that Kant set the main problem of his own theoretical philosophy, the critique of pure reason. He wanted to say there was a third type of assertion over and above truths of reason and truths of fact as described by Leibniz. And for a good deal of the 20th century, in slightly different terminology, the distinction between those two things has been absolutely central to philosophy. Some teachers of the subject, when I was younger, used to say, whatever else one does to one's pupils, if one gets that distinction across to them, it's been worthwhile their studying the subject. And that, I think you're quite right in saying, was put onto an altogether new level of clarity and explicitness by Leibniz.
Sometimes, because of our somewhat parochial Britishness, we tend to attribute this doctrine to Hume. And it is in Hume, and he probably did work it out for himself on the basis of pointers from Locke, as you say. But the fact is that Leibniz said it half a century before Hume, and said it very clearly, and said it over and over again.
Yes, the thing about Hume is it's done in a kind of drawing room, relaxed, rather imprecise manner. The nature of the distinction isn't very precisely worked out, whereas in Leibniz's case, a great deal of energy is expended on making it quite clear what the logical foundations of the distinction are.
Yeah. Another thing that Leibniz offers us is a solution again to the Descartes problem of interaction, a solution to the problem of how mind and matter interact. And his solution is entirely different from Spinoza's solution. Can you tell us what it is?
Yes, I mean, insofar as it is a solution, it's rather like preventing oneself losing at chess by kicking the table over, because in effect, he says, the matter is not real, matter is phenomenal. And so there isn't any matter in itself for mind to interact with. Everything that really exists is in some degree or other mental in nature. At the lower end, very rudimentary. At our end, quite sophisticatedly mental, and of course perfect in the case of God, who is a purely mental being, not at all the extended, all-inclusive physical entity of Spinoza's system.
Now, if he thought that there was, in fact, nothing sufficiently materially real to interact, how did he explain apparent causality? Because the world does, in fact, seem to consist of things interacting with each other.
Well, let me give you the short answer first, because it's going to provoke, I think, a further question. I mean, the short answer is, here are all this infinite array of mind-like entities which constitute the universe. And he says each of these, and this is actually what he says, each of these has a perception, very often a very obscure, confused, and limited perception of all the others. It has a point of view on the whole world. Now, each of these inner worlds of perception, the picture of the world formed in each of these spiritual centers.
And one should make it clear that these include us.
We're included.
Yes.
Is correlated. It's different from, but correlated with the perceptions of others. Like a whole lot of photographs taken of a scene from different points of view. They all, of a wedding group. Some of them that show the back of the head, some of them from the side, some of them from the front. But all the same persons can be identified. Well, likewise, every individual monad has its own perspective on the world. Now, Leibniz's view is that there is, in fact, no interaction between monads. There's merely a correspondence between their contents. Each monad has its own inbuilt history, which develops. One quality succeeds another in the history of the monad. But part of the content of the monad, a very principal part of the content of each monad is its awareness of other monads, and they are correlated by what he calls a pre-established harmony. And sometimes he uses this as an argument for the existence of God, that there is a pre-established harmony. Perhaps he needs God to show that there is such a thing.
I mean, this seems to be attaching overwhelming importance to God in the scheme of things, that God created everything, ordained the way everything is, keeps everything going all the time, including us. And therefore, there is no need for a belief in causality. I mean, the very idea of causality is it's a sort of extraneous or superfluous concept, because God is doing it all the time. And there's therefore, as it were, no way in which things can cause other things by interacting. All is being caused by God. But in this picture, how can free will come in? Because Leibniz certainly thought that he believed in free will in some sense.
It's quite right. His arguments for the existence of God are fairly traditional and conventional. They have some slight new attachments or modernities about them, but on the whole they're very much like those of Descartes and Anselm and others further back in the history of the subject. But what he does with the idea of God is very striking. I mean, he carries the idea of God's omnipotence a very long way and says God creates all the other monads that constitute the world and equips them with an intrinsic nature which decides or determines everything they subsequently do. So everything, as it were, is prepared by God. Leibniz himself doesn't see this theory of programming, as one might call it, of all the contents of the universe, which, as you rightly say, rules out literal causality between one thing and another, which is at best some sort of correspondence or regularity of happenings in one and another. Leibniz reconciles this as far as he can with free will, and indeed quite well, because in a way what lack of free will is to be caused to do things by something outside you, to be externally compelled to do something against the grain of your own real nature, you might say. Well, in Leibniz's picture of the world, every individual's determining force, once we get one on from God, so to speak, is the nature with which God has equipped that individual. So Leibniz, in a somewhat debating society way, could say, in no system of the universe are individuals freer than in mine. Every individual is perfectly self-determining. What more could you ask for freedom? But let me just make a more sensible comment on that. I mean, I was throwing myself into the metaphysical idiom there. The thing is, it seems to me that it's very difficult for rationalism to allow for anything we'd recognize as human freedom just because of its intellectual ambition. It's determined to explain everything. But if everything has an explanation, it looks as if that explanation is going to be causal, that everything that happens is going to be intelligible as part of some huge unitary design or plan.
So there's no room for the toss of the coin.
And there doesn't seem any room for any freedom for maneuver for the individuals in a world as conceived by rationalists.
Now, you started by comparing Spinoza and Leibniz with each other. Now that we've expounded their views at some individual length each, I'd like to come back to a joint question, so to speak. How would you assess their relative contributions to the history of philosophy?
Well, they contribute to different strands in it. Spinoza was much deplored in his own age. The thing you questioned, his sincerity in his religious professions, was very much questioned in his own age. People talked of the awful atheist Spinoza. Frequently, free thinkers like Hume and Bale did this. And it wasn't until the Romantic movement in Germany, end of the 18th, early 19th century, with people like Herder and Goethe, that Spinoza came more or less into his own. And he's always been an object of veneration because of his personal dignity, this unworldly withdrawal from ambition and self-affirmation and cutting a dash and all that. That was utterly foreign to Spinoza. He's a person of great sincerity. His own activities, his own life story is perfectly in accordance with his philosophic doctrines. And he's admired, therefore, but he doesn't appeal enormously to what one might call the more technical kind of philosopher. Whereas I would be inclined to say, of all the great philosophers of the post-medieval world, there is none who makes a more immediate appeal to the technical philosophers, at least of the Anglo-Saxon world, in the 20th century, because of his unwearying professionalism, his abstention from any form of rhetoric.
It's noticeable that Bertrand Russell, who wrote some 60 books, only wrote one book about another philosopher, and that was about Leibniz, with whom I think he probably must have identified very considerably. But one thing that strikes me about both of them, and I'd like to hear your views about this, is something that is in a sense unmodern about both of them, is that they were both profoundly and sophisticatedly versed in mathematics, and indeed Leibniz was a mathematician of genius and a mathematical physicist of genius. And yet both of them had this overwhelming concern with God and the place of God in the scheme of things. Now, I get the impression that there's a kind of subtext to a lot of this philosophy, that what they're actually trying to do is to maintain a conception of the world which can accommodate the new mathematical physics of Newton, but which has God in it. Do you think that's true?
Yes, I think that's certainly true. I'd just like to interpose, first of all, that despite all that mathematical-looking apparatus in Spinoza, he wasn't a mathematician, really. He'd studied a little mathematics, but he's in a completely different world from Leibniz, who, as you rightly say, is a major creative figure in the history of mathematics. In Spinoza's case, it's rather like the apparatus of pastoral poetry, and a pastoral poet is not really an expert on the culture of sheep or lamb rearing or anything like that. At any rate, but ignoring that for the moment, I think you're quite right about there is a common topic that obsesses them in some way, in which they both resolve in their very different ways, which is finding a place for religion in the world as it had come to seem in the light of the great post-Galileo and after discoveries about the nature of the physical world. Descartes' technique was more or less to sell ground, to say, well, the material world is unthinking matter, and that's where the Galilean rules prevail. But as well as the material world, there are individual human souls, and there's God. These are purely spiritual entities, both free, both detached from, though in various ways associated with, the material world. In other words, it was like splitting Germany into two, a demarcation. That area is given to physics, this area is preserved for religion. Both Spinoza and Leibniz are understandably dissatisfied with this kind of Solomonic carve-up of the cosmic baby, and are both anxious to combine religion and science. Spinoza does it, in effect, by adopting the world picture of 17th century science and then recommending religious attitudes towards the world so conceived. Leibniz, the other way round, wants to say the world is, in fact, much more, as religion represents it, a much more spiritual affair than science realizes, and yet we can rest the whole of the scientific conception of phenomena on an essentially religious understanding of the world as the working out of the purposes of an infinitely intelligent being, namely God.
Thank you very much, Anthony Quinton.